The night Avery left, the air in their Brooklyn apartment felt like wet paper, thin, sagging, unable to hold the weight of what was being said. Outside, sirens throbbed in the usual rhythm of the city, indifferent and eternal. Inside, Caleb stood beside the half-packed bed, watching her fold clothes with the quiet efficiency of someone clocking out of a shift that had run too long. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. That somehow hurt worse. "It's not about you," she said, eyes darting from suitcase to window, as if rehearsing an exit in real time. I need something better." Better. The word hung between them like perfume and poison. He wanted to ask what that meant. Better how? Better than what? But he knew the vocabulary. Bigger apartment, higher salary, more circles on LinkedIn. In a city that measured success in rooftop views and square footage, their one bedroom with its perpetually leaky faucet and second-hand furniture didn't count. Neither, maybe, did he. Avery smoothed her blazer, the one she'd bought after her promotion. It was navy, tailored, and ruthless. "You're a dreamer, Caleb, and I love that. She paused, almost tenderly. "I can't build a future on maybes." He wanted to tell her that dreams were the only real currency left, that his copywriting gigs paid rent and meaning in equal measure, but his mouth wouldn't open. Words, his trade, had deserted him. The city outside their window blinked its neon judgment. People moving forward, hustling, upgrading. He saw himself reflected in the glass, barefoot, hollow-eyed, holding a mug she'd bought at a Christmas market. When she finally zipped the suitcase, the sound was surgical. She didn't look back when she wheeled it out the door. Only the scent of her shampoo lingered, clean and citrusy, haunting in its ordinariness. He stayed there for a long time, tracing the faint ring her coffee cup had left on the kitchen counter. 4 years together, boiled down to 2 suitcases and a shoebox of keepsakes, ticket stubs, Polaroids, a keychain from their first trip to the coast. Each item felt like evidence in a case already decided. Later, as he scrolled through her newly updated Instagram bio, PR director, lover of light, growth, and good coffee. Caleb realized she had already deleted their photos. The algorithm had erased him faster than grief ever could. The city went on, loud and lit, while he sat in the dim glow of his phone screen, measuring himself against numbers, followers, titles, square footage, futures. Somewhere between them, he drowned. It arrived on a Tuesday, hidden between credit card offers and a takeout menu slipped under the door. A cream envelope, thick as a confession, embossed with gold lettering. Avery Sinclair and Nathaniel Pierce invite you to celebrate their union. Caleb stared at it for a long time before touching it, as though it might burn. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was too perfect, too curated, like everything else in her new world. He sat at the kitchen table, the one they'd once argued over at a thrift shop, and opened it with the slow precision of someone dissecting his own wound. The card gleamed. The venue was a vineyard estate in the Hudson Valley, late August. The photos online, because of course he looked, showed rows of grapevines, candlelit terraces, chandeliers hanging from oak branches. It was the kind of place where people spoke softly about legacy and balance sheets. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake. Then he remembered Avery's sense of narrative. She'd always believed in closure that looked good on paper. His phone buzzed before the thought could settle. Friends, when told, offered their predictable lines. "Don't go, man. She wants a reaction." "Go. Look amazing. Let her see what she lost. Crash it. Make it a story." Everyone had a theory, a script, as if heartbreak were a genre film and he'd missed his cue. Caleb nodded, laughed when required, but the noise only deepened the hollow ache behind his ribs. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself sifting through the shoebox again. Among the photos and ticket stubs was the locket, silver, oval, engraved with Avery's mother's initials. She'd lost it after the funeral, months before she left him. He'd found it under the radiator, cleaned it, meant to return it, but she was already gone. Inside was a photo of Avery as a child, sitting on her mother's lap, both of them mid-laugh. The clasp still stuck a little on one side. Beside the locket lay a folded piece of stationery, his letter. He'd written it 2 weeks after the breakup. Not a plea, not even an apology, but an attempt to explain how silence can be heavier than anger. He never sent it. The words had felt too fragile for the algorithmic air of her new life. Now, staring at the invitation, he felt something shift. Not vengeance, not longing, but a quiet resolve. He would go not to reclaim her, not to make a scene, but to return what was never his to keep. To end the story properly, without spectacle. In the following weeks, he prepared without knowing what for. He bought a suit, dark gray, simple. He stopped rehearsing imaginary confrontations in the shower. At therapy, when his counselor asked why he felt compelled to attend, he said, "Because pretending I'm above it means I'm still in it." The night before the wedding, he packed lightly. The letter, the locket, and a borrowed tie that still smelled faintly of his brother's cologne. Outside, the city hummed with late summer heat, neon spilling onto rain-slick pavement. Somewhere upstate, Avery was probably rehearsing her vows, her voice steady, her future perfectly lit. Caleb sat by the window, watching the skyline pulse, feeling both small and strangely grounded. The invitation lay open on the table, no longer a summons, but a mirror. It reflected not who he'd lost, but who he might yet become once he stopped orbiting her gravity. Dignity, Caleb discovered, was not a single act, but a discipline, something rehearsed, not performed. It required muscle memory, the restraint not to text, the pause before posting, the decision to leave a thought unshared. Therapy became his gym for it. Every Wednesday at 7 p.m., he sat across from Dr. Kellerman, who had the calm, unblinking presence of someone who'd watched hundreds of people unravel in slow motion. "Let's practice what you won't say," she told him one night, her pen tapping softly against the pad. He took a breath. "I won't tell her she looks miserable." "Good. I won't ask if she misses me." "Better. I won't tell her Nathaniel's just a promotion in human form." Kellerman smiled faintly. "Now we're getting closer to honesty. Not about her, about you." The sessions left him raw but cleaner, like scrubbing at a wound until it stung less. Outside, he'd walk down Atlantic Avenue, the city thick with late summer humidity and the smell of street food, neon blinking against puddles that refused to dry. He'd board the F train, find a corner seat, and stare at his reflection in the darkened window, a face both familiar and foreign. Between stops, he'd rehearse silence, shaping it like dialogue. There were temptations, always. The drafts folder on his phone was a museum of restraint. Unsent tweets, captions, fragments of righteous wit. Sometimes the one who leaves was already gone long before the door closed. Funny how better starts to sound like lonelier. Each one shimmered for a moment before he deleted it. The algorithm wanted a narrative, public pain packaged for engagement. But he was tired of being legible. He started writing longhand again, notebooks filled not with stories but sentences that felt like breathing. He rediscovered the quiet rhythms of life alone, the kettle whistling in the morning, the soft weight of a paperback falling shut, the comfort of no one watching. There was dignity in small, unshared things. When a friend invited him to a party in the village, he went. The room was loud, full of faces reflected in phone screens. Someone mentioned Avery's name. She'd been featured in an article about rising women in PR. Caleb smiled politely, felt his throat tighten, and excused himself to the balcony. The night air was warm, the city below indifferent. He breathed until the ache turned into something gentler, acceptance maybe, or fatigue. The next day, he bought a suit. Not the kind meant to impress, but one that fit quietly, in muted gray wool. The tailor, an old man with chalk-stained fingers, said, "You'll wear this when you want to look like you belong somewhere, not like you're trying to prove it." Caleb nodded. That felt right. At home, he hung it by the window where morning light could fall on it. It wasn't armor, not exactly, more a promise to himself when he stood before the mirror, adjusting the cuffs. He didn't see revenge, or even closure. Just a man learning the slow, unglamorous art of self-respect. The city outside buzzed, screens flickered, and somewhere in the distance, the algorithm kept whispering for a story. Caleb, for once, had nothing to give it. The road to Hudson Valley unwound like a slow exhale, miles of green rolling past the window, the kind of landscape that made the city feel like a fever dream he'd finally sweated out. Caleb drove in silence, the hum of the rental car and the rhythmic slap of the wipers keeping time with his heartbeat. The invitation sat folded in the glove compartment, creased from being handled too often. Every few miles he reached for it, as if to confirm that the address and the reality still existed. By the time he reached the estate, the late afternoon light had turned honey thick, pouring over the river and the sloping vineyards. The place looked unreal, like a photograph too carefully edited. White tents arched over manicured lawns. Waiters in pressed shirts carried trays of champagne flutes that caught the sun in tiny explosions of gold. The guests glittered, linen suits, silk dresses, watch bands that whispered money. The better life Avery had spoken of shimmered all around him, curated to perfection. Caleb parked far from the main path and walked in, the gravel crunching under his shoes, the faint hum of a string quartet floating across the air. He caught sight of her almost immediately. Avery, in a dress that seemed spun from light itself, laughing with a small circle of people near the terrace. Her hair was pinned up, her smile practiced, every gesture the performance of ease. For a second, his body forgot to move. Then the sound of a cork popping pulled him back, and he blended into the edges of the scene. Just another guest in a gray suit. He didn't belong here, but he'd already made peace with that. Belonging wasn't the point anymore. He drifted through the cocktail hour like a ghost. The conversations around him were all surface. Discussions of startups, travel, home renovations. Laughter punctuated the air like punctuation marks in a language he no longer spoke. Every so often, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Messages from friends who'd heard he might actually show up. Get a photo if you can. Make her squirm. You owe yourself that moment. He ignored them. At the bar, a waiter offered him wine from a label he recognized. One of Nathaniel's sponsors, no doubt. He declined, opting for water. The condensation from the glass dripped down onto his hand, cold and grounding. Around him, the string quartet shifted into something classical but uncomfortably modern, a soundtrack for curated happiness. He found a quiet corner near the riverbank, where the lights from the estate trembled across the water. The Hudson looked endless in the dusk, darkening toward blue. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the weight of the Saône locket and the folded letter. The metal was cool against his skin, the paper soft and worn at the edges. They were the only things tying him to her world, and the only things he intended to give back. From where he stood, he could hear Avery's laughter again, lighter now, or maybe just distant. It hit him, unexpectedly, that she didn't look cruel, just composed. Someone performing the version of herself the world expected to see. He wondered if she ever got tired of it, if even now she felt the quiet terror of pretending to have arrived. A breeze rose from the river, brushing against his collar. Caleb looked up toward the estate, its lights bright against the coming night, and inhaled. He wasn't sure what he'd say when their eyes met again, if anything at all. But for the first time, the thought didn't hollow him out. It steadied him. The music swelled. The guests began to drift toward the open-air pavilion, their laughter carrying across the lawns like the soft rustle of leaves. Caleb straightened his cuffs, took one last breath of the river air, and began to walk toward the sound. The reception had settled into its rhythm. Crystal laughter, the clinking of glasses, the polished hum of a band too perfect to be spontaneous. Candles glowed along the terrace, casting halos over linen and glass, over a crowd that had no idea what it meant to ache in public. The vineyard air smelled faintly of jasmine and wine. Caleb lingered just outside the pavilion, where the music spilled into the night like warm smoke. He hadn't planned the moment. It wasn't strategy. It was timing. He was simply waiting, breathing, holding the small weight of the locket in his hand when the bandleader announced the couple's first dance. A hush, then applause. Avery and Nathaniel stepped into the light. She looked like she belonged there, flawless and composed, her smile as symmetrical as a magazine spread. Nathaniel whispered something in her ear. She laughed, a sound Caleb had known by heart once. The music began, slow and syrupy, the kind designed to make people believe in permanence. And then, without thinking, Caleb moved. He stepped into the doorway between night and light, where shadows gave way to chandeliers. It wasn't dramatic. No raised chin, no calculated posture. Just a man crossing a threshold, quiet and real. The conversation at the nearest table faltered first, then another and another. The violin slipped a note. Somewhere a glass hit a plate too hard. Avery saw him. The smile froze, not in fear, but in recognition. The sudden, unfiltered knowing that some stories refuse to stay buried. Her hand on Nathaniel's shoulder stiffened, then fell away. The music wobbled. The pianist looked up, uncertain. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire room held its breath. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was a language older than words, one she still understood. The kind that said, "We began here, and something of us remains even now, standing in your perfect light." Whispers rippled outward like concentric circles in water. Guests craned discreetly. Some leaned to their neighbors. Nathaniel turned, confusion shading into irritation, then composure. The band stumbled, regrouped, and, without instruction, fell silent. It wasn't spectacle. It wasn't revenge. It was gravity. The quiet, inevitable pull of an unfinished story materializing in real time. Caleb's gaze held Avery's across the space. For a second, the years collapsed. Late-night takeout containers. The way her voice softened when she was tired. The arguments that ended in exhausted laughter. Then the image broke. She blinked, swallowed, turned her head slightly as if to signal control, but her hands trembled at her sides. He didn't move closer. He didn't want to steal her stage or turn her life into theater. He only wanted to return what he'd carried too long. He took a slow breath, stepped out of the light, and disappeared into the periphery again. The band tried to recover, easing into a different song, brighter, thinner. Conversations resumed, brittle at first, then louder, as if noise could plaster over rupture. The moment folded back into the evening, but its imprint remained. The silence between two notes no one would ever hear the same way again. Outside, the air was cooler, cleaner. Caleb walked toward the edge of the lawn where the vineyard met the dark river. Behind him, the music rose again, beautiful but slightly off-key. He didn't turn back. The silence he'd left behind was enough. The request came quietly, through the kind of discreet gestures that said more than words could. Avery's maid of honor approached Caleb near the edge of the terrace, her tone even, rehearsed. She'd like a moment, 5 minutes, inside. No explanation, just the formality of someone diffusing potential scandal. Caleb nodded, handed his glass to the nearest table, and followed her into the dim corridor that led to the coat room. The noise of the wedding, music, laughter, the clatter of champagne flutes, faded as the door clicked shut behind him. Inside it was cooler, lined with the faint smell of cedar and perfume, coats draped like shadows. Avery stood by the mirror, back turned, fingers tracing the edge of the counter as though grounding herself. When she looked up, her reflection caught him first. 2 ghosts framed in the glass, their distance visible in inches and years. 5 minutes, she said softly, not quite facing him. That's all I can give you. He smiled faintly. I won't need more. A silence settled, thick but strangely merciful. For a long time neither spoke. The air between them pulsed with all the things unsaid, the nights that had gone cold before they'd ended, the texts deleted mid-sentence, the feeling of being measured against invisible standards. When she finally turned, her eyes were damp, not from tears, but from restraint. I didn't leave because you weren't enough, she began. Her voice was steadier than her hands. I left because I couldn't stand how small I felt next to you. You were dreaming in colors I didn't even have names for. And she exhaled. I was building myself out of optics, of what looked like success. Caleb listened, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The faint sound of the band drifted through the walls, some upbeat tune masking the tension of a crowd, pretending nothing had happened. I told myself I wanted better, Avery continued. But better wasn't a person. It was a mirror I kept polishing, so I wouldn't have to see what I'd become. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough for his words to reach her without echo. You didn't know, he said, almost gently. But the job, the one that got you promoted, the PR firm uptown, I was the one who sent the recommendation. Quietly. They needed a reference, and I wrote it. Her breath caught. You... what? I knew you wouldn't ask me, he said. You were already halfway gone, but you deserved it. You worked for it. The confession hung between them, fragile as glass. Avery's eyes closed, and for a moment, she looked like someone who'd finally run out of ways to perform. God, she whispered. I thought you were the one holding me back. He shook his head. No, you were just trying to outrun something you already had. She looked down, fingers brushing the seam of her dress. Do you hate me? No, he said, the word coming slower than breath. I just stopped mistaking you for home. That was the truest thing he'd ever said to her, and she knew it. Avery's reflection met his in the mirror again. Two people framed by good intentions and bad timing, both realizing that what they'd called love had turned into something curated, maintained, presented. A portfolio of affection rather than the thing itself. Outside, someone laughed too loudly. A waiter called for more champagne. The world resumed its performance. Avery turned toward the door, her hand on the knob. Thank you, she said, the words carrying more grief than gratitude. For coming. For not ruining it. Caleb reached into his pocket and placed the locket on the counter beside her bouquet. The metal gleamed faintly in the low light. It was never mine to keep, he said. Their eyes met once more, not pleading, not forgiving, just recognizing. Then she was gone, heels soft against the carpet, rejoining her life like an actress returning to set. Caleb stayed a moment longer, the scent of cedar and her perfume lingering. When he finally stepped back into the hallway, the noise of the wedding rushed toward him again. Bright, hollow, endless. He walked through it unnoticed, carrying nothing now but the lightness of what he'd finally put down. The night had grown soft around the edges, the air heavy with wine and humidity from the Avançon lawn. The music rose again, something jazzy now, practiced joy stitched over earlier unease. Caleb lingered in the shadowed hallway near the coat room, watching the chandeliers tremble under the weight of laughter. The ceremony, the spectacle, had survived. That, he supposed, was its design. Avery had gone back to her world of curated calm, her gown gleaming under the golden light. Her voice carried faintly over the band, smooth, polished, untouched. Caleb could see her from where he stood, smiling, toasting, resetting the story for the guests who needed it tidy. And for the first time, he didn't feel erased, just separate. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. The paper had grown soft at the folds, as if it had been waiting to disintegrate. He could still remember writing it. The smell of burnt coffee, the radiator ticking, his handwriting wavering halfway through her name. It wasn't an appeal or an accusation. It was a map of where he'd been, written in the hope that naming the pain might lessen it. Now it felt like an artifact, something that belonged to the past as much as the locket did. He stepped back into the main hall. The bandleader announced another toast, champagne flutes lifted like a synchronized reflex. Caleb moved carefully through the crowd, past a cluster of guests debating real estate, past Nathaniel's colleagues who didn't know his name but eyed his suit with polite curiosity. He stopped near the gift table, a gleaming altar of embossed cards and curated generosity. There, beside a vase of white lilies, he placed the letter. No note, no envelope, no performance. Just folded paper, weighted with sincerity. Then he walked toward the exit. The bar buzzed near the terrace, laughter bouncing off glass and stone. Someone was already retelling the story of the interruption, spinning it into entertainment, smoothing its discomfort into gossip. Caleb heard his own name slip through the noise. The ex, the one who showed up, and kept walking. The night air outside was cooler, alive with crickets and the faint rustle of the river. The valet offered to bring his car around, but Caleb shook his head. He wanted the walk. The gravel path crunched beneath his shoes, each step loosening something inside him that had been clenched for months. He passed through the open gate at the edge of the estate, a wrought iron arch draped with fairy lights, the kind meant for photos. From the inside, it looked like a frame. From the outside, just a way out. Caleb paused there, looking back once. Through the trees, the estate glowed like a screen in the dark, everyone inside still chasing their version of better. He could have made himself part of that story, a viral clip, a whispered legend, the ghost at her wedding. Instead, he stepped beyond the light. His phone buzzed again. Messages, curiosity, invitations to explain. He silenced it. No captions, no content. The story didn't need an audience anymore. He walked down the narrow road toward the faint shimmer of the river, the night folding around him like a closing curtain. There was no applause, no lesson to tweet, just the sound of his own footsteps, steady and unhurried, heading toward a life that didn't need to be witnessed to be real. The band recovered first. A few uncertain notes, then rhythm reclaimed. The chatter swelled again, nervous laughter turning back into real laughter, glasses clinking in renewed choreography. The guests, eager to forget the ripple, built a surface so glossy it almost erased the silence that had sliced through it minutes before. Avery returned to the center of the terrace, her smile restored, the photographer framing her in forgiveness by composition. Caleb, by then, was already gone. His absence another secret folded neatly into the night. Outside, the estate lights flickered over the river like a closing scene. The air smelled of lavender and wet stone. He drove back to the city in near darkness, the hum of tires a metronome for thoughts he didn't bother to finish. When dawn broke over Brooklyn, he left the suit jacket on a chair and fell asleep on the couch, shoes still on, hands empty for the first time in years. Weeks passed quietly, like an aftertaste. Life resumed, not dramatically, but with the slow precision of a clock being wound back to function. Caleb found a steadier job at a small design firm in Dumbo, where deadlines mattered less than decency. The work wasn't glamorous, but it gave him structure, a schedule, a reason to leave the apartment, the small grace of being needed without performance. On weekends, he volunteered at a community arts space in Red Hook, helping teenagers with writing workshops. They came in restless, half-present, carrying phones and stories and noise. But sometimes, when they wrote, the room went still. He recognized that stillness, the fragile peace of saying something true when no one's watching. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar at first. Inside, just a single page. Avery's voice, written carefully. You were right. I kept choosing what looked alive over what was. I'm sorry for mistaking your quiet for failure. No signature, no return address. Just that. He read it twice, then folded it back into its envelope and placed it in the drawer with unpaid bills and spare batteries. There was nothing to answer. Some apologies were meant to close, not reopen. Autumn settled over the city. The air turned sharper, cleaner. On Sunday mornings, he walked to the waterfront with a cup of black coffee and watched the ferries move across the East River, deliberate and slow. The skyline shimmered, proud and distant, but he no longer measured himself against it. Better, he realized, had changed shape. It wasn't the life with polished glass and curated success. It was waking without dread. It was an apartment that stayed quiet after midnight. It was laughter that didn't depend on performance, silence that didn't sting. Sometimes, when the city lights blurred in the river, he thought about the wedding, the band starting again, Avery's face turning back toward her guests, the sound of music pretending nothing had happened. And for the first time, the thought didn't hurt. It just existed, like a chapter you don't regret reading but wouldn't choose to repeat. Caleb took another sip of coffee, the wind brushing his collar. The morning was ordinary, and in that ordinariness, he felt something almost holy, the quiet relief of a life he could finally inhabit without flinching.